Um, so if it's okay, I'd like to transition to some questions for you
Oh,
from the
yeah, that'd
group.
be great. Yeah.
And unless you want to, say something in the next couple of minutes and then we can move on to questions, or should we just dive in? Whatever.
Yeah, let's dive in for some questions. I gave you guys a lot to chew on. So,
Awesome. Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I can also, I know Janice's favorite color was purple, so you can any questions you guys want to ask, I will try to answer them.
Yeah, yeah. So I'll just encourage the group to, maybe put your questions in the chat box. And then, Holly was also interested when we talked on the phone the other day, Holly was interested to know if anybody on this call have a Janice story or a remembrance or some, memory of going to a fabulous concert, or, and if so, maybe just raise your hand, the raise hand option, I guess, and Leslie can kind of we'll circle back to you, but that would be really fun to hear if anybody has some
Yeah,
personal.
definitely. Yeah, that was one of my favorite parts of my book tour, was traveling all over the country. And even when I did some national radio shows and stuff like that, hearing from, both men and women, but I have to say women's stories were incredible, who remembered, again, we're talking 52 years ago, maybe, or 53, that people saw her perform, and or people met her. I've got to hear from college students who were on the concert committee that brought her to the university where she performed, and had this incredible exchange with her. So she seemed to have affected a lot of people, and made a real impact on them. So yeah, so if anybody got to see her at the Fillmore or at college or anything like that, I'd love to hear about it.
So first question that came in a couple of days ago, actually, from one of our members. The amount of research is just amazing in this book. So, the notes at the end just go on and on and on. I can't imagine the process. But someone was really interested to hear about your writing process, and maybe talk about that. And also they were interested in what's your favorite part of the process and what is the most difficult part for you.
Oh, great question. Well, my favorite part is definitely the research. I could keep researching forever. I love meeting people and interviewing them. I love doing all the digging and being like a treasure hunter, trying to find never before heard recordings. And, and in fact, just luckily for me, I was able, through my literary agent, to make an agreement with the estate. Her siblings, brother and sister, are still alive. And the family saved everything. I mean, the mom, Dorothy Joplin, still had saved all of Janice's, from birth all the way. And so I made an agreement with them that they would allow me to have access to all these materials, and that they would give me permission to quote them. But in return, they would not get to tell me what to write. They couldn't have approvals over what I wrote. Obviously, if I sent them my manuscript when it was all finished, and if they saw any mistakes, they could let me know if I got a relative's name wrong or something. But fortunately, they didn't send me any changes. So that was a real help, just to have that kind of access. And so that was definitely my favorite part. I mean, I literally got to fondle Janice's boas and check out her outfit that she wore, on the Dick Cavett show, and and then just going through her letters and actually just reading her letters and her handwriting, and that was amazing. I just love that part. That's my favorite. The writing part for me is, even though I've written lots of books, that's always the hardest part. I'm very, very self-critical. And I've worked as an editor too. So as I'm sitting there writing, I'm just so self-critical. That's very anxiety causing and really difficult. So that's the one part that I don't really love. It's kind of like the Dorothy Parker quote, I hate writing, I love having written. So, but once it's done, and once I get through in the editing part, that's really great too.
Great,
so I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. Great. I think since we're in or near Woodstock, can you talk a little bit about her connection to Woodstock, the concert, and Albert Grossman?
Yeah, definitely. And even though I have to say, even though I love interviewing people, just when you're getting your feet wet on a project, and, once in a while, interviewed so many people, but you know, sometimes people are not up for being interviewed, or can be unpleasant or difficult, or you feel like you're not knowledgeable enough. You know, there's a lot of prep that you do beforehand. So what was so fantastic for me was living up here and getting to actually start off the whole process, interviewing some people that I already knew in Woodstock that knew Janice, who had spent time with her, that remembered her from when she was in and out of town a little bit, you know, with Albert's place being up here. So that was really great. So, and just to get to see these places where she hung out was awesome. And that's the one thing, I mean, I really like to, I'm so obsessive with the research that I like to go to every place the person lived. I try to go into the house if possible when I got to with some of Janice's homes. And you know, just kind of feel their vibe. You know, I read the books that that was the other thing with Janice, in those letters she wrote, she'd write about books that she was reading. So I would read books that she read. She'd write about albums she was listening to. I would listen to those records. So the same kind of thing, getting to meet people and talk to them in Woodstock who knew her, that was a great way to get started. And then weirdly enough, this was a bizarre little story, but the wonderful WDST, our Woodstock radio station, which is located actually in a studio building that was built by Albert Grossman for Todd Rundgren, another one of his clients. And I've had many opportunities to go on the various DJs shows to promote different books of mine when they came out. They've been really super supportive. And so literally I was in there doing a radio interview about my Alex Chilton biography the day I was going to go to meet with Simon & Schuster, my publisher, with the editor there about possibly publishing the Janice book. So we were chit-chatting, some of the DJs and I, and they're like, oh, well, you know, famously, Janice would always, you know, she had the famous, you know, painted Porsche covered with this. It was the most famous car in America in 1969. It had this whole kind of hippie, psychedelic collage painting all over it. And whenever she was in Woodstock, she would always park it at this little secret spot in that parking lot right there where the Albert Grossman's complex was and still is, where the Bear is and the Bear Theater, etc. And I'm like, oh my gosh, they showed me exactly the spot. I'm like, that's where I always park my Mini Cooper. Little did I know, I was parking in Janice's old spot. And sure enough, I left that interview, went to the city, and got my book deal with Simon & Schuster. So there you go. If that's not a great Woodstock karma thing, I don't know what is.
That's funny, and that kind of relates to the next question, which is, you know, how other than sharing a parking spot, how did you personally relate to Janice, and what surprised you about her?
Well, I think just going back to being at that age, you know, 13, 14, you know, for I think a lot of young women, it's a very angsty time when you're maybe not feeling the greatest, or not having much self-confidence, or feeling, you know, I felt kind of an outsider. You know, I wasn't a cheerleader, and all my girlfriends were becoming cheerleaders, and I was more into music and, you know, wanted to be a hippie, even though it was a little bit overdue at that time. But anyway, she just kind of, I just felt a kindred spirit to her. She was a real bookworm, and I was a bookworm, and I like to wear weird outfits, or she inspired me to wear crazy outfits and stuff. So there was just a lot about that I connected with her about. And just, you know, I think a lot of us at that age feel a lot of insecurity. And, you know, Janice had so much insecurity that she never really had the time to outgrow. I mean, she was still a very insecure person, even when she died at 27. And when I look, I think I was probably still pretty insecure at 27 too. But I just felt like on a personal level, I really connected with her. Sadly, I could never sing. I played in bands, but I always played really bad guitar and would sing quiet background vocals. So I never had any musical talent like Janice by any means. But I just think the fact that, you know, she, I think, was such a role model for us women who didn't feel like the traditional kind of popular girl in school, you know, during that junior high period. And she had a really rough time, it turns out, from my research, when she was about 14 as well. So.
Thank you. Someone on the call was interested in knowing your opinion on, you know, has the sexism that Janice endured in the industry, do you have a sense of if that's improved?
Well, I think, women have, kicked down the doors, beginning with Janice, and now they're a force that can't be denied. I think women are finally making more money in the music business than, say, the huge difference, say, women who are actors, or the pay inequity between male and female actors, because women have proven in recent years to be the biggest hit makers. Everything from little mini me, Billie Eilish, who started recording at home with her brother when she was, 14, the age Janice first discovered, music, etc., to, women like Beyonce and Lady Gaga, Madonna, of course, in the 80s was a real powerhouse. So I think becoming popular musicians and having power that way have helped women be treated more equitably financially. But there's still a lot of differences, especially in country music. And this is like a new development. We're talking just the past, say, my son has just turned 22. And I did a big box set that I produced that came out right around the time he was born in 1998, called RESPECT, A Century of Music by Women. And doing a lot of research for that box set, I discovered that really up until, like the late 90s, women started getting more airplay, but there was literally a rule on radio, which still holds true in country music radio, that you could not play women artists back to back. And in fact, most of them would only play women, once every couple of hours or something on the playlist. And it was the same thing earlier for record labels. Women, well, we've got one girl singer, so we're not going to sign any more. It was really like that. And I think it still exists to an extent. Definitely as a music journalist, I started writing about music when I moved to New York in the early 80s. I started writing about music for little fanzines for no money, but to try to get into the bigger magazines was really, really difficult. I had a hard time. It took me a long time to do that. So I just started playing in bands myself, like screw that. But then finally, by the 90s, I did start getting into Rolling Stone and places like that. But it was really tough to break in. And funnily enough, just the other day on Facebook, I saw someone posted, a musician, of course, said, hey, we're always, ranking the best rock critics. Let's rate the best, rock critics in history. And there was this big list and not one single woman on it. It was all guys, so I think historically women have been left out a lot of the, music books. I think Janice herself was stereotyped again by, the Buried Alive, Maya Friedman's book helped a little bit in this regard, but a lot of male critics just kind of wrote her off as being, yeah, she was a great singer, but she destroyed herself, and never really gave her credit for being a songwriter, for being a band leader, for being, on her way to becoming a producer. There was a lot of her story that was just left out of these, music books. But I think it's really changing. I see it with my son's generation. They don't really see, it's hard for them to even fathom the way it used to be as far as the inequities go.
Interesting. Is there a way, I'm not sure, well, your opinion, is there a way to hear some of the recordings that maybe aren't so readily available?
Oh, yeah. I mean, thank God for YouTube. I'm telling you, there is so much great stuff. If you want to hear how she sounded back in 1963, when she was trying to make it in San Francisco and doing those blues songs, or even in Austin in 1962, there's people, again, were so blown away by her. They would do little reel-to-reel recordings of her singing. So if you go into YouTube and put Janis Joplin, 1962 blues or whatever as a search, it'll come up. Also, I believe I included, if you want to go back, I had the great, happy, good fortune of getting to be on Terry Gross's show, Fresh Air, back in October. And it was, it turns out Terry Gross was a fangirl. It was so exciting because I'm a fangirl for Terry Gross. And she saw her at SUNY Buffalo in 1968 when she was a college student. Terry Gross told me off mic. And she was all kind of almost fluttery. And I'd been on her show before for my Gene Autry book. She's a big Gene Autry fan. But she ended up, I was talking about some of these early recordings, and she said, oh, it'd be great to have some of those sprinkled into our interview. So I connected her producer with a source for those. So if you go onto Fresh Air's archive and listen to that interview, you'll hear some of the songs in there too. I think Careless Love, maybe a Lead Belly song that she did, but you can definitely search those out.
Very cool. Thank you. What was her siblings' response to your book?
Well, fortunately, I was a little nervous because, you know, you just never know when you're writing a biography, something's going to rub somebody the wrong way. But both of them have been very supportive. And I got to do a book signing actually back in Port Arthur with Michael Joplin, who just worshiped his big sister. Janice was an only child until she was 6. And then Laura came along. And then when she was 10, her brother Michael came along. And so she and Michael were really close because he wanted to be an artist and all that kind of stuff. She and Laura really loved her to death too, but you know, they had a little bit of that sibling sister thing, just a wee bit of that. But anyway, both of them were great. As far as being very supportive. Laura gave a nice blurb for the back jacket of the book about it. And Michael was just so nice when I got to hang out with him in Port Arthur. That was just in January. And what was so gratifying was because Janice horribly, her last visit home was that awful, I don't know if anybody's seen or heard about it, but she had this horrible 10th high school reunion where I think it was literally like she had PTSD, you know, just all the sad, bad things that happened to her senior year in high school came back, and it was this awful, awful experience. And then she died like 6 weeks later. But anyway, so she'd had a troubled relationship with her hometown because she also, like I said, when it bleeds, it leads. I mean, she knew how to give these blurbs. So she would totally diss her hometown to like Time Magazine and other, you know, music journalists. So a lot of her people from town really hated her for that, like giving her hometown a bad name. But anyway, when we did that book signing in January, it was so amazing. Over 300 people came. There was a line around the block, people lining up, and poor Port Arthur is just, it used to be this boom town back in the day. Now it's barely hanging on, but people came from all over to have their books signed. It was incredible. It was just so gratifying, and all different types. That was the other thing too. You know, every color, every, you know, the gender spectrum, you know, like you name it, they were all there, all age groups, from a woman who was like 100 years old came, who had worked with Janice's mother at the business college in town, to, you know, young women to bringing their babies they named Janice. I mean, it was so gratifying. It was amazing.
That's great. Awesome.
Yeah.
I'm going to shift a little bit here. This is something that we talked about on the phone the other day. You know, I think with people being isolated, this is a time that I think we're all thinking about, you know, memories, and perhaps some of us have started writing some personal memoir, you know, stories. You know, you just have such a huge body of work. Can you give us some tips about the memoir process, or what we should be thinking about if we want to start to sort of jot down some stories?
Yeah, well, definitely don't do what I do. Like, don't start, you know, criticizing yourself and, you know, get all anxiety ridden about it. I mean, the best thing to do is just start writing and just start letting it out, you know. Sometimes what I'll do, if I don't want to sit there in front of a blank screen, I'll walk around and think about stuff. And I'm doing lots of walking right now. I don't know about you guys, but we're so blessed to live in this beautiful Ulster County. And while I'm walking, I'm just thinking of ideas and things like that. So a lot of times, as soon as I get back, maybe I'll just run to my computer and just type in a few ideas that I've had, or maybe before I go to bed that night, I'll type in a few ideas. So in the morning, the next day when I wake up to actually really work, I've already got some ideas right there on the screen to kind of get me going, because sometimes that blank screen can be very daunting and you don't want to just kind of sit there, you know. And the other thing is to just keep reminding yourself that it's a process. as far as the writing goes. And I have to remind myself that, even though I've been doing this for 30 something years, is that, you know, of course it's not going to be perfect. You know, I love Jack Kerouac, but that whole first thought, best thought is kind of bullshit. You know, it's like, you've got to, you know, finesse it. You know, you're like a sculptor, and your writing is like a piece of marble, and you're just going to keep chiseling away and making it better and better and better and better. So you just need to have that, you know, persistence to stick with it, and definitely jot down your ideas when you get them, because you can get amazing flashes of ideas. So you definitely want to record that so you don't forget it. And even if you want to record some of your ideas, if it's a memoir, if you're thinking back to your past and you suddenly have this remembrance that you totally forgotten about, if you can't, you know, write it down or type it, then, you know, even record it so you don't forget about it. And that, I find that I've worked with a lot. I've never written a memoir myself, but I've written quite a few essays where I have to think back to my life, etc. But having worked with some other people, I co-wrote a book with Michael Lang, and he was having to remember stuff from planning the Woodstock Festival, and it was really hard to remember. So sometimes you discover little tricks that can, you know, kind of snap your synapses, and suddenly you start remembering things. So when you do that, you've got to grab those so you don't forget, definitely. Also, I can't recommend enough, there's some really great workshops and writers groups. In fact, if anyone, Sparrow, my neighbor up the street who's a published writer, is getting ready to have, I think, a free memoir writing workshop. So I think it really helps a lot, especially when you're just starting out, to be in a workshop situation where, number one, you kind of have a deadline, so you have to have some material ready for your next meeting. And number two, you can get feedback from others who are also working on their work. And sometimes when you're giving somebody feedback about their work, it's going to, you know, give a light bulb in your head about your own work. So I've always been in writers groups. Since I moved up here from New York City in the late 2001, I've been in writers groups ever since then, and we share our work and commiserate and give feedback. So that's a huge, huge help. I can't stress that enough.
Great, great, thank you. So we're at 6 after. This has flown by.
I warned you that once I start gabbing, you can't shut me up.
No, it's just amazing. The stories are amazing, and your just knowledge of Janice is incredible, and you could go on forever.
Yes.
So Leslie, do you want to take things back, Leslie? No.
Wait, you got to unmute your mic. There you go. Yay, Leslie.
Zelda, did you want to say something?
I'm sorry, are you directing that to me or?
To Zelda.
Oh,
Zelda, you want to say something?
Yeah, I just had, I had a couple more questions, but I don't know if we have time. I don't know if everybody, I don't know if our writer wants to stay on, or if everybody wants to stay on. I do have a couple other questions, but
Yeah, I'm fine with it. I don't have anywhere to be right now, sadly.
Okay, I don't have a dinner date. Okay. So I was curious to know if there were sections of the book that you didn't write, or a story you didn't tell because you felt like it would cause too much, too many problems if you told it, or if there was a story that you just loved and you just didn't have room for.
Well, it's really more, sometimes you hear these amazing stories, but I started my career in journalism as a fact checker, actually, for the Rolling Stone Encyclopedia of Rock and Roll when I first moved to New York, in the early 80s.
Insane in the Trump administration.
Yeah, exactly. So, I tried to only include material that I could really verify. Obviously, if it's a family member or a band member that told me this story, that they were there. But even those stories, I mean, you guys have probably heard of the whole Rashomon, the famous Japanese film. Like 3 people can be in the same room at the same time and remember something totally different, from one another. Mm-hmm. So if there was enough semblance of information for me to draw my conclusions, which story was correct, there were a few stories that I heard that would have been incredible to include, but I just could not back it up. I mean, actually, I'll tell you guys, one of them was her younger sister, Laura, was convinced that Janice may have been sexually assaulted as a teenager, possibly like, by a gang of guys. She was really bullied and picked on really badly. And she thought that perhaps she had actually been sexually assaulted then. Others, thought she graduated high school a virgin, and I did meet a couple of people and have found enough material to find out supposedly her first lover, when she was about 18. But in any case, I asked everyone that she confided in, that she was really close to. And I just think even if the trauma had closed that off to her, that at some point she would have, some memory of that would have come back. I just really think she would have told someone. And then very weirdly, interestingly enough, and again, Laura Joplin, may have conflated these things, or maybe without even realizing, I just recently found out, and again, I mentioned before, I've met so many interesting people since the book came out. I met this incredible woman who is a retired attorney down in the city, who lives in Brooklyn, and she was one of, there was a small number of Jewish families that lived in Port Arthur. And strangely, Janice, all of her best friends were Jewish, and they all went to this, same synagogue. Her best friends in school, from like 8th grade to 12th grade, or 7th grade to 12th grade. And so this woman, her family moved to Port Arthur, and her dad was the rabbi when Janice was a senior. And they became, friends. Like her older sister became really good friends of Janice, because again, this town was very, anti-Semitic, racist, at that time. So Janice went over and made friends with the family, welcomed them, played songs for them, would visit them. So she really stood out to that family. And the woman that I met, it turns out, she was about 6 years younger. It turns out, I just found this out literally about a month ago, that another woman whose sister was one of Janice's best friends was sexually assaulted. But this was years later, after Janice, had moved away. This, I think, she's blanking on when the date was, but it was later on in the 60s. And it became, and one of the assailants was a judge's son in Port Arthur. So it was in the papers, and it was a big, big deal. So that did happen to a young girl. But I think now that, because I always thought, like, could it have happened? Because I've read a lot about sexual assault and date rape and all that. And a lot of the characteristics that victims exhibit were things that Janice was doing, et cetera. So I thought it was possible. But now I think that that her sister found out about what happened to the other young girl years later, and kind of thought maybe, kind of mixed it up in her mind and thought maybe that was Janice. So that was like the most major thing. And I discussed it with my editor at Simon & Schuster, and she agreed that since we had no evidence, no proof, and Janice had never mentioned it to anyone, that, not to go with it, So as far as actual stories of substance, that would have been a big thing, but I just felt like I couldn't include it, because it's such it would become almost like the elephant in the room. It would take so much energy, and if I couldn't prove it, it could just change the way people thought about her or something. So but that's a good question.
Okay,
And there's tons of minutiae I left out. I always put in way too many details. You could probably tell from my talking now that my editor had to like rein me in, like, okay, this is enough deep dive into the history of Columbia Records, blah, blah, blah. I geek out on all that tech, music.
They want me to wrap it up, but just because I think other people in the group would like to hear too, is you mentioned somebody named Sparrow who is doing writing workshops. How would we find this person?
Oh, what I'll do is I will email to you guys, and if Kristen and Gloria don't mind, since we're connected on email, circulating it. I just got an email from him, and he's doing it through Zoom. So now that you guys have got your feet wet with Zoom, right? So I know he's doing a free one, and he's a real character. His wife, Violet Snow, is also a writer, and she's written memoir as well. He's a real character, and I'm a trustee of the Phoenicia Library Board, and so originally he was doing writing classes at our library, and they were very successful, very well attended. People seem to really love them, but of course now can't do that. So he's doing the Zoom classes. There are also, you know, memoir writing workshops you can take via, which are, you know, a little more, they're expensive, but you get a real professional who's published memoirs, is through Martha Frankel, who runs the Woodstock Book Festival. And I know she actually does memoir writing workshops and is a, you know, memoir writing coach as well. So if you got, you know, really serious about it, if she might not be doing it right now due to the pandemic, but she could, you know, put you in touch. So if you even go to the Woodstock Book Festival's website, if you Google that, you can contact her that way.
Okay, thank you.
And
Thank
that's
you.
memoir always a big part of her. Sadly, the book festival I was going to be part of it this year. It was going to be a really good one. It was going to be, you know, back the end of March, but so this year's canceled. But she says that she wants us all to be back next year. She's already even got the date for it. So they always have a lot of really great memoir, you know, published authors doing presentations. And then they also do some memoir workshops during the book festival every year too. So, but you probably don't want to wait a whole year away, but just to say.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Holly, it's Leslie. Thank you so much. And just wanted to say that everyone can get your book at, let me take a picture, at Golden Notebook, right? In Woodstock?
Yes, Golden Notebook. Here, I'll hold it up there. There it is. Yeah, and Golden Notebook has been terrific in that oh, thank you, Gloria. If you wanted a signed copy to you or to a friend or whatever, you can call them up, and the bookstore is open from 11 to 3 every day, and they have a whole socially, you know, distant way of, you know, you pay for the book over the phone, and then you give them the information if you want it signed to a certain name, and then they contact me, and then I would go by and they put it out on a table and have it, you know, open. So you sign it without touching, and then, you know, then whatever. So they do it very safely. That's what I'm trying to say. So if you want something personalized, something like that.
I also touched base with Rough Draft in Uptown Kingston, and they have copies.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. In fact, they have some signed copies, and I just got an email from them that they're doing the same thing, that you can pick books up at the door. And they've started reopening again, I think, their little coffee bar. So that would give me a good excuse to come over to Kingston. So if you wanted to get one of those and request that I sign it to you, I would be happy to drive over there and do that and have an excuse to get one of their yummy, you know, coffees.
Yeah. And Barnes & Noble has it. And I think Oblong Books as well.
Okay, yeah, I know. I was under the impression that they might have sold out of the signed copies, but I know that they did. I did an event there, which was a lot of fun back in the fall. So yeah, I'm glad to hear they stopped some. Good.
So this has been great, and I can't wait to read the book, and I'm going to get a few for my siblings, that's for sure.
Yay. Well, I tried to make it read like a novel. So, and luckily a lot of people, I have not to brag, but I've heard from so many people that weren't even big fans of Janice's, didn't like her music that much, but just they really got drawn into her story as being a woman who overcame so many odds to have as many accomplishments as she did. And then also, because I think those letters, I really kind of felt like I knew her. So I think as a character, she really comes across as this person that you can kind of connect to. So if, you know, so you kind of get a double dose of like biography, but also like reading a novel. That was my goal, at least. So.
Well, I can't wait to read it. And hopefully we'll get a book group together, and that'll be the first book we discuss.
Oh, cool. Great.
Yeah, thanks, Holly. And to